Asterisk, he served his country with honor, saved countless lives, and came home a hero. So why was he now standing in court like a criminal? The judge took one look at him, and what happened next silenced the entire courtroom. Asterisk, the morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows as people filed in, expecting another day of routine hearings. No one could have predicted the silence that would sweep through the room when the next case was called. The doors creaked open, and in walked Sergeant David Cole, a tall, broad-shouldered man in an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands shackled in front of him. His military posture hadn't left him, even in chains. Eyes turned, whispers followed. Some recognized him instantly. He was the Marine who had pulled fellow soldiers from a burning vehicle under heavy fire, who had saved a group of schoolchildren during a humanitarian mission overseas. His name had once been celebrated on the news, but now he was being charged with assault and unlawful possession of a weapon. The contrast was jarring. Judge Meredith Lawson, a woman known for her firm but fair courtroom, stared down at the paperwork in front of her. The service record attached to David's file was thick commendations, medals, tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, letters of praise from commanding officers. It didn't match the man the prosecution described, a violent offender who had taken justice into his own hands. The room grew tense. David sat quietly, calm and respectful, his eyes scanning the courtroom. He recognized no one until his gaze landed on an elderly woman in the back row, holding a small photograph of a young Marine, her son, one of the soldiers David had saved overseas. Her eyes met his, full of sorrow and silent support. Cameras clicked, reporters whispered. But David didn't flinch. He had faced gunfire and explosions. He could face this too. Still, something felt off. The prosecution seemed too eager, the story too one-sided. The judge raised an eyebrow as she flipped through the pages again, and as she read aloud, Sergeant David Cole, recipient of the Bronze Star for Valor, Purple Heart. The courtroom fell completely silent. No one moved, no one spoke. In that moment, it was clear this wasn't just a case. This was a test of justice, of how a nation treats its heroes when the uniform comes off. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, the prosecutor stood up with confidence, her tone sharp and direct. She painted a picture of Sergeant David Cole as a dangerous man, a trained fighter who had taken the law into his own hands. According to the report, David had attacked two men outside a convenience store late at night and was found with an unregistered handgun in his vehicle. Too many listening. The words seemed to fit the paperwork, but something about it felt off. Judge Lawson listened carefully, occasionally glancing over at David, whose expression remained calm but unreadable. Then, it was the defense attorney's turn. He stepped forward slowly, holding a thick manila folder. "Your Honor," he began, "what the prosecution left out is why Sergeant Cole was there that night." The lawyer opened the folder and pulled out security footage. The room watched as the screen showed a shaky black and white video of a woman being cornered by two men outside the store. She struggled, screaming for help. Moments later, David's truck pulled up. He stepped out, said something to the men, and when they lunged at him, he defended himself and the woman using controlled, non-lethal force. The gun was never drawn. It stayed in the truck, untouched. The woman in the video. She was sitting quietly in the courtroom now, tears in her eyes. When called to the stand, her voice trembled as she spoke. "He saved my life," she said. "They were going to hurt me, and no one else stopped. Only him." The prosecutor tried to argue the legality of the weapon, the risk of escalation, but her voice was losing strength. Judge Lawson leaned back in her chair, processing everything. The courtroom felt heavy with realization. This wasn't a man out for violence. This was a protector, a soldier who hadn't stopped serving, even off the battlefield. And now, the story was no longer about what he did but why the system was trying to punish him for it. Eyes began shifting. Minds started to change. And the judge, she looked furious. Judge Meredith Lawson had seen hundreds of cases in her courtroom, some tragic, some violent, and some deeply unfair, but nothing had struck her like this one. As she sat in silence, her fingers lightly tapping the bench, her gaze fixed on Sergeant David Cole, the weight of his file, filled with acts of bravery and honor, now lay in front of her alongside a short list of criminal charges that suddenly felt hollow. The courtroom remained still, the air tense, everyone waiting for her next words. For the first time in the trial, the judge leaned forward, her voice steady but filled with restrained emotion. "I've read every line of your service record, Sergeant," she began, looking directly at David. "You've risked your life more times than most of us can imagine. You've protected this country with everything you have. And now I'm being asked to see you as a threat." She paused, her eyes narrowing at the prosecution. "Let me be clear, this court does not excuse illegal activity, but context matters, intent matters. And when the law loses sight of humanity, we're no longer serving justice, we're just punishing people blindly." The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but the judge raised her hand sharply. "Enough," she said. "You had your chance to present your case. What I saw in that video and what I heard from that witness tells a very different story than the one you're pushing." Turning back to David, she continued, "What you did that night may not have followed every letter of the law, but it followed the spirit of it. You protected a life. You de-escalated a threat. And you did it with discipline and restraint." The room was dead silent. Reporters stopped typing. Even the guards stood a little straighter. The judge leaned back, sighing deeply. "This court finds no reason to continue this trial. Charges dismissed." A gasp rippled through the room. David sat frozen for a moment, then slowly stood. For the first time in days, his hands were free. And for the first time in months, justice finally looked him in the eye and saluted. As the judge's gavel struck the bench, the sound echoed like thunder across the silent courtroom. For a full second, no one moved, frozen in disbelief at what had just happened. Then, slowly, like a wave washing over the room, the tension began to break. The guards looked at each other, unsure of whether to move forward or step back. Finally, one approached Sergeant David Cole and gently removed his handcuffs. The cold metal fell away from his wrists, and with it, the burden of humiliation and misunderstanding. David looked down at his hands, rubbing the red marks left by the shackles. It wasn't just physical freedom that had returned to him, it was dignity. The courtroom, still quiet, watched as David took a slow, deep breath, then turned to look at the woman he had saved. She stood with tears running down her face, nodding silently, mouthing the words, "Thank you." For the first time since his arrest, David smiled, not out of relief, but from a deep place of peace. The crowd began to rise to its feet. First a few veterans in the back row, then more people followed. It wasn't a cheer, nor applause, it was respect. A silent salute from strangers who now understood the full truth. The media crews outside rushed to capture the moment as David stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight. Reporters shouted questions, but he said nothing at first. Then, standing tall, he spoke calmly. "I didn't do what I did to be called a hero. I saw someone in danger, and I acted. That's what I've always done. That's what I was trained to do." His voice didn't shake, but it carried pain of judgment, of nearly being forgotten by the country he had sworn to defend. But today, he wasn't forgotten. Today, he was seen. And as he walked away from the courthouse, not as a criminal, but as a man finally heard, the truth followed him. Sometimes justice wears a robe. Sometimes it wears boots. And sometimes, it walks out of a courtroom with its head held high. The courthouse doors closed behind him with a soft click, but the noise outside was anything but quiet. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones extended, each one desperate to get a quote, a reaction, anything. But Sergeant David Cole didn't speak, not yet. He stood at the top of the steps, breathing in the fresh air like a man tasting freedom for the first time in months. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a few quiet words of congratulations. But David's eyes were searching the crowd. Then he saw her, the woman he had saved that night. She stood near the back, no cameras on her, no reporters asking her questions, just her arms wrapped around herself, eyes locked on him. David made his way through the crowd, ignoring the press, until he reached her. She stepped forward, tears already forming. "I never got the chance to say it properly," she whispered. "Thank you. You didn't have to stop, but you did. You saved my life." David gave a small nod. "You don't owe me anything," he replied softly. "I did what was right." A few feet away, someone began to clap. It started slow, uncertain, but quickly grew. Soon, others joined, veterans, onlookers, even strangers who had only heard pieces of his story. It wasn't a celebration of victory. It was recognition of his sacrifice, his courage, and the injustice he had endured. Later that evening, back at home, David sat alone in his living room, the silence unfamiliar after weeks behind cold concrete. His uniform, stored in a box for years, now rested across the back of a chair. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up, running his fingers over the medals pinned to the chest. He hadn't worn it in a long time, not because he was ashamed, but because he thought no one cared anymore. But now, something felt different. The world hadn't changed overnight. But for the first time in a long while, it had listened, and maybe, just maybe, it was beginning to understand. The next morning, David Cole woke up to a world he barely recognized. His face was on every major news outlet, TV screens, front-page headlines, and online articles. Hero Marine cleared of charges. One read, "Judge defends war veterans' actions in stunning court decision," said another. But David didn't feel like a hero. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, staring at the TV without really watching it. His name was being spoken by people who had never met him, debated by news anchors who had never seen war. Some praised the judge's decision, others questioned the legal system, but very few talked about what really mattered, what it had cost him to stand up for someone in danger, and how easily the country he served had almost turned its back on him. The phone rang, constantly calls from reporters. Old friends, military buddies, even politicians looking to stand with him. But David didn't answer most of them. He wasn't interested in attention or praise. What he needed was peace. Later that afternoon, he walked to the local Veterans Center, a place he hadn't visited in years. The staff welcomed him with open arms, offering quiet respect rather than questions. He sat in a circle with other veterans, men and women who knew the weight of combat and the silence that follows it. There, for the first time in weeks, he spoke freely. About that night, about what it felt like to be treated like a threat instead of a protector, about the anger, the fear, and the heartbreak. One older Marine leaned forward and said, "You did the right thing, brother, but what happened to you? That's why we keep showing up. So the next guy doesn't go through it alone." That hit David harder than anything else. Not the trial, not the cameras. That simple sentence. As he left the center that evening, he felt something lift. He wasn't just a man who survived war anymore. He was part of something again. And now, more than ever, he realized his fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The following week, David Cole was invited to speak at a local town hall meeting, an event organized by veterans, community leaders, and families who had followed his story closely. At first, he didn't want to go. He wasn't a public speaker, and the thought of standing in front of strangers to retell something so painful made his chest tighten. But something inside him shifted. This wasn't about his reputation anymore. It was about all the other veterans who were forgotten, misjudged, and silenced. So, he put on a plain button-up shirt, not his uniform, and walked into the community center packed with over 200 people. The room fell silent when he stepped up to the microphone. For a moment, he said nothing, just looked out over the crowd, young, old, military families, law students, even local police officers. Then he spoke. "My name is David Cole. I served 3 tours overseas. I've carried brothers out of burning vehicles. I've seen the best and worst of humanity, but nothing prepared me for coming home and being treated like a criminal for doing the very thing I was trained to do, protect others." His voice didn't rise with anger. It stayed calm, steady, but heavy with truth. He spoke about the night of the arrest, about the courtroom silence, about the feeling of standing alone even while doing what was right. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about understanding, about seeing the full story. He shared how many veterans face the same misunderstanding, how trauma, split-second decisions, and civilian life collide in ways people don't always see. The room listened. Not out of sympathy, but out of respect. When he finished, the crowd stood, not clapping wildly, but slowly, with a quiet reverence that meant more than noise ever could. Afterward, dozens approached him not for autographs, but for conversations. Some shared their own experiences, some just said thank you. That night, as David walked home under the quiet stars, he didn't feel like a victim anymore. He felt like a voice, and for once, the world was finally listening. In the weeks that followed David's powerful speech at the town hall, something unexpected began to happen. His story started to spread, not just in news articles or viral clips, but in living rooms, classrooms, and police stations. Across the country, veterans groups began to share his case as a symbol of what was wrong and what needed to change. Law students studied the courtroom transcript in universities. A retired judge from another state even wrote a public letter, praising Judge Lawson for her courage, calling her decision a rare moment where justice met compassion. David, meanwhile, didn't chase the spotlight. He kept to his quiet routines: morning walks, time at the Veterans Center, coffee at the same diner he had always visited. But people began to recognize him. Strangers shook his hand. Some just nodded with quiet understanding. Then came the invitation that caught him off guard, a request to testify before a congressional hearing about the treatment of veterans in the legal system. David hesitated. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't trained for speeches, but he knew this was bigger than him now. He agreed. The day of the hearing, he wore his service uniform for the first time in years. As he walked through the marble halls of Capitol Hill, his boots echoed louder than any words. When he sat before the panel, he didn't read from a paper. He simply told the truth about what it feels like to serve and return home to a system that doesn't always understand the cost of service, about the fear of being punished for doing what was right, about the need for better support, better laws, better awareness. The room was filled with silence. Pens paused mid-note, phones set down. For once, the politics faded on, the reality remained. After he finished, a congresswoman leaned into her mic and simply said, "Sergeant Cole, thank you for reminding us what justice is supposed to look like." David didn't smile. He just nodded. Because this time, he wasn't standing for himself. He was standing for every soldier who came home and felt unheard. And his voice was no longer just an echo, it was a movement. Months passed, and what began as one man's courtroom battle had turned into something far greater. Inspired by David Cole's testimony, lawmakers introduced a new bipartisan bill aimed at protecting veterans facing legal action for incidents tied to service-related trauma or acts of public defense. The bill proposed training for law enforcement on identifying signs of PTSD, better legal representation for veterans, and consideration of military background during prosecution. It was called the Cole Act. David never imagined his name would be on anything in Washington, not a medal, not a speech, and certainly not a law. But there it was, discussed on the Senate floor, argued over in committee meetings, and praised in newsrooms across the country. Still, David remained grounded. He spent most of his time visiting VA hospitals and holding quiet meetings with younger veterans who were struggling to find their place back home. Some came with legal issues, others with wounds no X-ray could detect. David didn't have all the answers, but he listened on that was often more than they'd ever been given. His story gave them hope, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. He had fallen, been judged unfairly, but stood back up and kept walking. That's what resonated. One afternoon, after speaking to a group of new recruits preparing for deployment, a young soldier approached him and said, "Sir, I used to think being strong meant never breaking, but your story showed me that strength is getting back up when you do." David looked at the soldier for a long moment, then smiled, the kind of quiet, steady smile that only comes from pain that has found purpose. He shook the young man's hand firmly and said, "Remember that, out there and when you come home, especially when you come home." The system was far from perfect, but change had begun, and in a world where headlines fade fast, David's story had lasted because it wasn't about fame or victory. It was about justice, truth, and the courage to speak up not just for yourself, but for those still fighting in silence. The first crisp breath of fall rolled through the quiet streets of David Cole's hometown as he stood on the small hill overlooking the local park. Hands in his pockets, watching kids play football where he and his friends once did. It had been nearly a year since that day in court, since the chains came off. The truth came out, and the world finally listened. In that time, his life had changed, but not in the way the headlines suggested. Fame never interested him. He had turned down book deals, TV appearances, and political offers. What mattered to him now was something simpler: peace. Not the kind found in silence, but the kind earned through healing, service, and truth. The Cole Act had passed with overwhelming support. Across the country, veterans were finally getting the legal and mental health support they deserved. Police academies now taught about combat trauma, courts reviewed cases with new guidelines, and young soldiers entering service were being told clearly that their sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten when they returned home. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for David, that was enough. That afternoon, he stopped by the local high school, where he'd been invited to speak at a small assembly. He stood in front of a room full of teens, some restless, some curious, and told them not about war or politics, but about choices. About standing up for others even when it's hard. About doing what's right, even when it's misunderstood. And about how strength isn't loud, it's quiet, steady, and often invisible. When the students clapped, he nodded humbly and made his way out, greeted by familiar faces and grateful strangers. As he walked back home, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting a golden glow over the sidewalks he once rode his bike on as a boy. David Cole had been a soldier, a protector, a prisoner, and a voice for justice. But now, at last, he was simply what he had longed to be all along: a man at peace, in a country that had finally remembered what it owed to those who serve. He was home. And this time, he was staying. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Subscribe to Deep Wounds for more powerful, real-life stories that need to be heard.